Cleopatra wasn't Egyptian, and she played the world like chess. Cleopatra VII wasn't born under a pyramid. She didn't speak Arabic, and her skin wasn't dark like the pharaohs who built the temples of the Nile before her. She wasn't Egyptian by blood, not even close. She came from a Macedonian Greek dynasty, the Ptolemies, who had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years after Alexander the Great stormed through with his armies and declared the land of the Nile a new jewel in his imperial crown. Cleopatra, by birth, was a foreigner, and yet, when the world hears her name, they think of Egypt. Gold crowns, cobra-headed headdresses, the Nile bending to her will. Because Cleopatra didn't just sit on the Egyptian throne, she claimed it like a goddess and played the greatest power game the world had ever seen, one move at a time. Her story didn't begin with luxury. It began in chaos. When Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE, her father, Ptolemy XII, was a weak, unpopular king. The Roman Empire was growing teeth, swallowing kingdoms left and right, and Egypt was no exception. Her father paid Rome massive bribes just to keep his throne, while his people starved and rebelled in the streets. Cleopatra watched as mobs screamed for her family's blood. She learned quickly. The throne wasn't something you sat on, it was something you fought to keep every second. And when her father died in 51 BCE, the war for that throne exploded. Cleopatra was just 18, brilliant, multilingual, sharp-eyed, but she couldn't rule alone. Egyptian law demanded she marry her brother, a boy of just 10. So she did, but only in name. She had no interest in being anyone's puppet, not even for family. She pushed to rule as queen in her own right. She spoke to diplomats, addressed the people, and printed coins with only her face. Her brother's advisors hated that, so they struck first and banished her. Cleopatra fled the palace with nothing, but she didn't panic. She didn't weep. She watched and waited. And then she made the boldest move of her life, one that would make her legend. She turned to the most powerful man on earth, not a priest, not a general, but a Roman, a man whose name made kingdoms tremble, Julius Caesar. Now, Caesar didn't care about Cleopatra. He cared about Rome, money, and control. But Cleopatra was no fool. She didn't walk into his court and beg. She smuggled herself into it, rolled up in a rug, unannounced, unexpected, and unforgettable. When Caesar unrolled that carpet and found a young queen staring up at him with burning eyes, something shifted. This wasn't a girl. This was a tactician, a queen who thought in moves. And that night, Caesar didn't just gain a lover. He gained an ally with fire in her veins. The next morning, everything changed. Cleopatra marched back into Alexandria at Caesar's side. Together, they crushed her brother's forces. The boy king drowned trying to flee the palace. Cleopatra was now queen of Egypt, alone, unquestioned, and carrying Caesar's child. But Cleopatra wasn't finished. She didn't cling to Caesar like a desperate woman. She used him. She learned from him. And when she visited Rome, she didn't come in chains like other conquered royals. She came as a goddess, in jewels, draped in silk, riding in a golden litter. The people whispered that she was Isis reborn, but the Roman Senate whispered something else: fear. They didn't like how close Caesar was getting to this foreign queen, how much influence she held. And not long after, Caesar was dead, stabbed 23 times on the Senate floor. Cleopatra, pregnant and vulnerable in the heart of Rome, was now the target. But instead of breaking, she vanished. She sailed back to Egypt, rebuilt her court, raised her son Caesarion, and waited for her next move. Because Cleopatra didn't mourn, she calculated. She wasn't just playing a love story, she was playing for survival. And the next player in her game was coming. The dust of Caesar's murder hadn't even settled before Rome began to split at the seams. Alliances shattered, friends turned into rivals, power-hungry men carved up the Republic like vultures. And while Rome burned with ambition and betrayal, Cleopatra waited in Alexandria, watching from the shadows, draped in gold and strategy. She wasn't just mourning a fallen lover, she was preparing for her next move. Because Cleopatra didn't just survive power, she seduced it, studied it, and broke it down into predictable patterns. The world underestimated her once. It wouldn't happen again. Back in Rome, Caesar's top general, Mark Antony, had risen in the chaos. He was a soldier, not a thinker, charismatic, battle-hardened, and burning with a hunger to prove himself. He had shared victories with Caesar, marched into war beside him, and now wanted to inherit not just his power, but everything he left behind, including Cleopatra. So when Antony summoned her to meet him in Tarsus, expecting her to bow, to plead, to show weakness, he had no idea what was coming. She didn't sail in quietly. She arrived on a barge of silver and scented wood, its sails perfumed, its oars gliding in rhythm like a procession of gods. Cleopatra didn't step off the ship. She descended like Aphrodite, wrapped in jewels and linen, her face painted with purpose, her voice low and confident. Antony didn't meet a widow. He met a storm, and within minutes, he was captivated. But Cleopatra didn't just flirt. She calculated every smile, every compliment, every silence. She tested him, measured his pride. And when she saw that Antony, for all his strength, was ruled by ego, she leaned in. They drank together, laughed, shared stories of war, betrayal, prophecy. She showed him Egypt not as a land to conquer, but as a kingdom worth worshipping. And within weeks, Antony had given her more than loyalty. He had given her his heart, his ambition, his mind. Together they became something ancient and new, a goddess queen and a Roman warlord. But this wasn't a love story. It was a power pact. Cleopatra didn't need a protector. She needed a shield against Rome's rising tide. And Antony, he needed money, ships, and troops. Egypt offered him all three. But Cleopatra offered something more dangerous: purpose. She made him believe he could be more than Caesar's shadow, that he could rule not just Rome, but the world. And so they rose together, defiant. Cleopatra bore him children, twins, then another son. They celebrated in Alexandria, declared their children kings and queens of lands not yet conquered. They crowned themselves rulers of the East, and Rome watched, furious. To the Roman Senate, this wasn't just arrogance, it was treason. A Roman general bowing to an Egyptian queen, letting her dictate foreign policy, fund his campaigns, raise his heirs in silk instead of stone. It was an insult too great to ignore. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, used it as fuel. He painted Cleopatra as a foreign witch, a temptress who'd corrupted Antony and turned him against his people. Propaganda flooded Rome. Statues of Cleopatra were vandalized. Playwrights mocked her in the streets. She was called a serpent, a disease, a threat to Roman purity. And it worked. Rome prepared for war, not just against Antony, but against Cleopatra herself. But the queen did not flinch. She armed her ships, fortified her cities, studied Roman movements like a chessboard. She knew their plays before they made them. And as the final confrontation loomed, the famous Battle of Actium, Cleopatra didn't wait in the shadows. She stood on deck beside Antony, in armor, commanding her fleet. The battle was brutal. Skies darkened with smoke. The sea churned with broken ships and bodies. And when the tide turned and Antony's forces faltered, Cleopatra saw the inevitable. She turned her ship and fled. Not out of cowardice but survival. She knew the war was already lost. Rome was too strong, too united behind Octavian. But Antony, broken and confused, took her retreat as betrayal. He followed her back to Egypt, his pride shattered. Their alliance was crumbling, their empire done. But Cleopatra hadn't played her last card. Even as Antony spiraled into despair, drinking and raging, Cleopatra began sending secret messages, not to her allies, but to Octavian. She offered surrender, peace, her crown, even her life, if her children could live, if Egypt could survive. She no longer fought for power, she fought for legacy. But Octavian wasn't Caesar. He wasn't charmed by her brilliance or moved by her beauty. He wanted conquest. Total, clean Roman conquest. When Antony heard rumors that Cleopatra had betrayed him, that she was negotiating with Octavian, he snapped. In a fit of rage and heartbreak, he threw himself on his sword. Dying, bleeding, he was carried to Cleopatra's hiding place. And there, in one final moment, he died in her arms. But Cleopatra didn't scream. She didn't crumble. She stared at his body, the last man who had ever matched her ambition. And then she prepared to meet her end. Because Cleopatra had always known how this would end. The halls of the palace in Alexandria were silent now. The music had stopped. The generals were dead. The Roman flags were at the gate. And Antony, her last ally, her last love, her final co-ruler, was cold in her arms. Cleopatra didn't cry. She had already buried too many emotions, too many truths, too many chances. What she had left now wasn't desperation. It was calculation. Even in defeat, Cleopatra wasn't done playing. She had one move left, and it had to be perfect. Octavian, the heir of Caesar, the man who would soon call himself Augustus, was on his way. He had crushed every enemy, absorbed every rival, and now he was coming to finish the job. Egypt was the last piece of the puzzle, but Cleopatra wasn't going to let him walk in and claim it like a souvenir. She would set the terms, or she would burn the board. She ordered herself, wrapped in regal silk, eyes painted, jewels placed on her fingers. She surrounded herself with symbols of power, not because she was showing off, but because she knew something about men like Octavian. They wanted to see submission. She gave him a queen, a spectacle, something bigger than fear. And when Octavian entered Alexandria and demanded her audience, Cleopatra met him not on her knees, but on a throne. She knew how to perform power. Octavian saw a woman past her prime, a fading queen, but Cleopatra was already playing 3 moves ahead. She made him an offer, Egypt, peacefully. Her treasure, her crown, her loyalty, if he let her children live. If he let her rule in name, quietly, under Rome's shadow. It was a deal meant to preserve the illusion of power, even as she lost it. But Octavian didn't want illusions. He wanted legacy. He wanted to march Cleopatra through the streets of Rome in chains, as a trophy. As proof that no queen, no lover of Caesar or Antony could stand against him. That's what he wanted the world to see, Cleopatra humiliated, broken, and when she realized that was the plan, her final decision became clear. She wouldn't be paraded like an animal. She wouldn't be remembered as a slave. She would choose the moment, the place, the legacy. Cleopatra returned to her chambers. She sent away her servants, save for 2 loyal women, Eros and Charmian. She penned letters, sealed them with gold, sent one to Octavian. He would open it too late. Then she gathered the things that mattered. Her children were hidden away, safe, for now. Her treasures, her history, her gods. And then, the asp. Some say it was a cobra hidden in a fig basket. Others claim it was poison hidden in a hairpin. No one knows for certain. That's part of her game. She made sure her final act was as mysterious as her life. Cleopatra slipped into her death as if it were a performance, and in a way, it was. When Octavian's guards broke down the door, it was already done. Cleopatra lay on a golden couch, dressed like a goddess, a mark on her arm, a faint smile on her lips. Charmian and Eris, her most loyal companions, lay beside her, dying too. When they asked Charmian what had happened, she whispered, "It is well done, as becomes the descendant of so many kings." Then she died. Octavian stared at the scene. This wasn't a victory. This was something else, something haunting. The queen had denied him his grand parade. She had denied him closure, and she had written her ending on her terms. Cleopatra's body was buried beside Antony's, just as she wished, in Alexandria, in Egypt, in the land she loved and ruled until her final breath. Her tomb, if it still exists, has never been found. Like her death, her grave became a mystery, a rumor, a myth, lost to time, perhaps by design. And so ended the last pharaoh of Egypt. But the ripples didn't stop. With Cleopatra gone, Egypt became a Roman province. Her children were hunted. Caesarion, the son she bore with Julius Caesar, the last blood heir to the Roman dictator, was killed on Octavian's orders. "Too many Caesars," he said coldly. The twins she bore with Antony were taken to Rome, raised in obscurity, married off as political pawns. But Cleopatra had already won something deeper. She had written herself into history not just as a ruler, but as a symbol. She wasn't just a queen. She was a strategist, a mother, a lover, a warrior, a diplomat, a storm that forced the greatest men of her time to recalculate everything. She made Rome flinch. Twice. And she didn't just live in palaces and poems. She lived in stories, in politics, in the DNA of how women in power are feared, misunderstood, and mythologized. She was painted as a seductress, a manipulator, a siren. But what she really was smart, calculating, ruthless when she had to be, but always thinking, always plotting, always watching. The truth? Cleopatra didn't lose. She exited. On her terms. Cleopatra was dead, her empire absorbed, her dynasty extinguished, but something strange happened in the centuries that followed. She didn't disappear. She multiplied. In scrolls, in paintings, in plays and poetry, Cleopatra didn't just survive history. She became its favorite illusion. A queen too powerful to erase, too dangerous to explain, too unforgettable to ignore. And it started almost immediately. After her death, Octavian, now Augustus Caesar, made sure that no statue of Cleopatra stood in Rome. Her name was wiped from public monuments. He seized her treasure, destroyed her navy, took her children. But no matter how thoroughly he crushed her legacy, there was one thing he couldn't control: what people whispered when he left the room. Because Cleopatra had left behind something more powerful than gold or armies, she left behind fascination. In the Roman imagination, she morphed into something else. The historians who followed, Plutarch, Cassius Dio, Suetonius, didn't know her. They weren't there. But they heard the echoes, and they wrote her not as a ruler or a scholar, but as a temptress, a witch, a woman whose eyes could bring down empires. It was easier that way. Easier to believe that Caesar and Antony fell because they were seduced, not outmaneuvered. That they were bewitched, not bested. And that's how the myth began. For centuries, Western writers painted Cleopatra as a femme fatale. Beautiful, sinister, exotic, dangerous. William Shakespeare gave her her most famous words: "Give me my robe, put on my crown. I have immortal longings in me." But also turned her into a tragic lover, defined more by romance than rulership. Painters in Europe depicted her draped over Antony, clutching asps, dying in drama. Poets imagined her sighing in scented chambers, pining for Roman generals. Gone was the woman who spoke 9 languages. Gone was the strategist who funded armies and rewrote alliances. She had become a fantasy. a woman men feared, and so reshaped. The East remembered her differently. In Arab, Persian, and Egyptian texts, Cleopatra was respected as a philosopher queen, a scientist, a ruler with astronomical knowledge, medicine, and mathematics. Alchemists cited her writings for centuries. She became a figure of learning and depth, not seduction. But those stories didn't travel far. Europe had already decided what Cleopatra was, a warning. But the myth didn't stop evolving. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as archaeology awakened interest in ancient Egypt, Cleopatra was reborn again, this time in gold and eyeliner. Movies gave her face to Theda Bara, Vivian Leigh, and most famously, Elizabeth Taylor. Her image was now inseparable from glamour. Bold eyeliner, red lips, glowing skin, jewels, silk. She was no longer feared, she was desired. And that, too, was its own kind of myth, one that stripped away the strategy and left only the seduction. But beneath the makeup and Hollywood tropes, a deeper truth endured. Because Cleopatra may have been a queen, but she had to rule like a chess master. Every move had stakes. Every alliance was a calculation. Every word was a weapon. She wasn't playing dress-up. She was fighting for survival. In a world ruled by men who wrote the rules, then rewrote the history. And maybe that's why her myth is still so alive, because Cleopatra represents a question we're still asking. What happens when a woman refuses to be a pawn? She was a woman who refused to marry quietly, who refused to be a decorative figurehead, who refused to give her power away, even when it cost her everything. She aligned herself with the most powerful men of her time, not because she was weak, but because she understood strength. She seduced, yes, but she also strategized, negotiated, and ruled. Her intellect was sharper than any sword she ever needed. And even in death, she got the last word, because the woman they tried to erase became unforgettable. She turned her story into a mirror, and every generation since has seen what it wants in her reflection. To some, she's a villain. To others, a victim. To some, a romantic. To others, a revolutionary. But to those who look closer, who brush aside the veils and legends, Cleopatra isn't just a woman who lived 2,000 years ago. She's every woman who's ever been underestimated, every ruler who's ever been rewritten. Every strategist who's been called emotional, every leader who's been called manipulative, every genius who's been called lucky. She was never playing checkers. She was playing chess. And she was playing it long after everyone else had put the board away. It's been over 2,000 years since Cleopatra walked the marble halls of Alexandria, since she spoke to emperors like equals, since she stood on the deck of her ship, staring down a continent that wanted her erased. And yet, her name still drips from the tongue like honey laced with venom. Cleopatra. Say it once, and 1,000 images flood in: beauty, power, poison, gold, fire, silk, strategy. Every generation has tried to claim her, or destroy her, but none could ignore her, because Cleopatra wasn't a queen made by birthright. She was made by resistance. Every step she took toward the throne came with blood in her wake and eyes watching her fall. But she never did. Not when her brother tried to exile her, not when Caesar was murdered, not when Antony lost his empire, not when Rome marched for her crown. She never begged, never bent. She chose her lovers, chose her weapons, chose her end. And when history tried to define her, she outwrote it. They said she was a beauty, as if that was her weapon. But what they didn't say was that Cleopatra could speak 9 languages, that she read philosophy in Greek and gave speeches in Egyptian, the first of her dynasty to even learn the native tongue, that she negotiated with generals while nursing her son, that she funded navies while Rome cracked under civil war, that she used religion, image, and myth like a sculptor uses stone. Cleopatra didn't use men. She used systems. She looked at how the world worked and worked it better. But what made her dangerous wasn't her romance. It was her independence. It was the fact that she ruled, that she made decisions, that she didn't flinch when armies approached or when gods were silent, that she didn't crumble in grief or drown in vanity. She wore a crown, but more than that, she wore command. And that's why they feared her. You see, power hates a woman who doesn't ask for permission. History doesn't know what to do with her. It rewrites her, softens her, turns her into perfume and eyeliner, or slanders her, twisting her into a temptress who ruined men. But Cleopatra didn't ruin men. She matched them. She surpassed them. She stood eye to eye with the two greatest generals of the ancient world, and didn't blink. And in the end, she didn't let them write her final chapter. She didn't go out in chains. She didn't let her name become a footnote in someone else's victory. She chose death, but not defeat. That's not a tragedy. That's legacy. Cleopatra's life was a war. Every day, a negotiation between survival and sovereignty. And yet, she left a mark that empires couldn't erase. You can destroy armies. You can burn books. You can melt statues and topple temples. But you can't silence a story told loud enough, long enough, and with enough fire behind it. And Cleopatra's story still burns. She lives on in every woman who's had to prove she belongs in the room, in every leader who's been judged more for their face than their mind, in every daughter of history who inherited not wealth or comfort, but resistance and brilliance. She is a mirror, not for who we were, but for who we are still trying to become. And here's the truth no one tells you. Cleopatra wasn't playing a love story. She was playing for a throne, for a legacy, for her name, and she won. Because thousands of years later, we're still saying it. We're still fascinated. We're still remembering. You want to know what real power looks like? It's not armies, not gold, not even a crown. It's being unforgettable. It's being so bold, so sharp, so undeniable that they try to erase you for centuries and fail. Cleopatra didn't die with her kingdom. She didn't die in the palace. She didn't die in Rome's shadow. She became the shadow. So next time they tell you the game is already set, that the rules are written, you tell them about the queen who rewrote every rule and still made history bow at her feet. This wasn't just a queen. This was Cleopatra. And if you don't know her by now, you're still playing checkers. Like, comment, and subscribe, because here on Uncle Luke Tells, we don't just tell history, we bring the rulers back to life.